Yes, hecklers need mics. Yeah, get on the mic if you're going to heckle us.
Come up here and talk to this mic. That's funny. You're doing? Perfect. So what we're doing is we have them all muted. When you're going to speak, if you just take and tap the top gently, it'll tell him which one to unmute. Because they told me that we're getting too much noise in the video, some people that watched it. So we're going to try to see if we keep all the mics muted, and then when you want to speak, just tap it and he'll find you. Hopefully by next week we'll have these all color-coded and that'll solve that problem. Anyway.
What is this one? 4237?
5437.
54.
And my social security number is, since we're live on your internet, right?
I don't have to write it down and pre-record it.
Sure.
Oh, you gotta go to docs.
There it is.
What happened to yours? There it is. There we go. All right, so we wanted to try to summarize or maybe close some loops on the series or the number or the different ones we've been doing over the past couple weeks that we've been doing these together like this. So we started off like 2 weeks ago and we talked about the abortion issue and we talked about how the solution is not a political solution and it's not an apolitical solution. That the solution is not to vote and it's not to vote. It's like, you know what I mean? We as citizens, we need to vote. We need to vote our conscience. We need to vote our values.
That's right.
We need to vote. But as Christians, we shouldn't look at that voting and think that the voting is going to actually change anything, because the real change that's needed, whether it's in the abortion issue or any other issue, the real change that has to happen cannot come down from a legislative branch or an executive branch. It has to come out of each person's conscience and heart, right? And that's what Jesus clarified when he gave the Sermon on the Mount, that there was no external law that could make the change that was needed. What was needed was going to have to come from within. That's the promise of the new covenant, that God said he's going to write a covenant in people's hearts. And that's what we looked at 2 weeks ago. And if you would like to kind of go through a little bit what we looked at last week, Mike.
Okay, so last week we began to cover on the idea of envy. The concept that what happens a lot in this social environment we have is actually a philosophy of envy that comes out and the evils that come out of that. And it took us a little while to get down to say, this is what the real problem is, but we started talking about the divisions and how those divisions work against each other, and said in the end that the Bible describes this as a philosophy of envy, that the problem that we have with society today. And then we noted how it turns out that we have the same challenge with envy that we do with the abortion issue, in that we have that responsibility in society, but we also have the responsibility to the kingdom, right? So there's those two sides of the story. And that brings us into this week, and if you'll introduce our topic this week.
So this week we want to try to tie these together, all of these things, and look at what might be an underlying cause. And we've called this first part of the Sunday school confusion, because that is what we see in the world today. And I don't think anybody would dispute that. Are we okay?
You tell me, are you guys having to shut mics on and off back there?
Just so we don't get the echo.
We need to stop that. We have to find a way to stop having to do that.
Well,
Because otherwise we lose the first three words of what each other says.
well, you want to try turning the gains down, or is that not working for you?
You're just picking up on each other's
It's
mics.
picking up each other's mics.
All right, we'll turn this one down a little too. I think what we're picking up more is the volume on that. Okay, so, excuse me. So what we see here is we see that there is a I think what we would all agree with in the world today is that there is a massive amount of confusion when it comes to values, when it comes to morality. It's not that there's depravity, right? It's that everything seems to be turned upside down. And we look at it, I think any sentient Christian looks out at the condition of our society today, and there is no better word I can find to describe what we see but mass confusion. I mean, we can look at it in social justice arena, or we could look at it in the critical race theory. I don't know if you've researched that or you know what that means, but you should look into that because this is a huge driver of our modern day politics. If you don't know what critical race theory is, then you may think that what's happening is organic, that what's happening in our society today when it comes to the ideas of white privilege and the ideas of race and race equity and all of these things, you may think that these are just simply organic movements that have come up, and they're not. This is an orchestrated political philosophy that was been articulated since the 70s and has been being pushed, starting with academics in higher education, but it is now has trickled down through that, and it'll soon be in all your public schools if it isn't there already. And then you can look at and I think the coup de grace of all of this confusion is we look at the whole gender identity thing, where it's like now there are no men and women. It's whatever you identify as. And if you identify if you're a man who identifies as a woman, then the state has to put you in a prison if you're a criminal, right? And you identify as a woman, then the state will put you in a female prison. And if you're a man who identifies as a woman, then the high school has to allow you to use the girls' locker rooms and things like this. And to look at this and say that this is not confusion, right? I think that's looking at it pretty oversimplified then.
Okay, and you might wonder, how did we get to where we're at right now? And look at the it feels like we went to sleep one day and everything was normal, and then we woke up the next day and everything was confused, right? It can feel that way, but in truth, this has actually been drawing along over time, like train cars with one thing leading on, and as Michael was saying, when we look at this whole confusion that we have, there's actually a set of ideas that sort of lead this whole engine of confusion, pulling all these things behind it. And if it keeps going the way it is, it's just going to keep adding more things, more cars of confusion on the end. I mean, what could be less confusing than gender, right? You're born male or you're born female. And somebody would say, yeah, but there are some exceptions in there. There's various versions of hermaphroditism. But we would look at those and say, that's an abnormality, right? The vast majority of normal, if you thought of it that way, the vast majority of normal is male or female. In fact, hermaphroditism is clearly not male or female, but that's clearly a different category. And so when you think of how this thing pulls along, and we say, okay, so first thing we did was confuse gender. I don't know if you've seen some of the videos that are done by like Matt Walsh and people like that. Go out and ask, how many genders are there? And the answers they get are almost funny, but they're actually sad, because the answer is, I don't know, 50, 70 genders, things like that. So not only do we have men who are being confused as a woman and women who are being confused as men, but we have a whole rainbow, in fact, more than a rainbow, a whole spectrum of genders that are caused, and this is a terrible example of the confusion. But the point that I'm making here is that when we look at this, these turn out to actually be all iterations of the same fallacy, just under different names.
So we can look at this, and I would like to try to get some of you involved and we'll see what you think on this. But we can look at this, and when we look at all these different things, and they seem very disparate, they seem very different, right? So you have like gender, identity, and critical race theory. You have traditional economic Marxism and income equality over here. And when you look at all these things, it doesn't seem like there's immediately a similarity between them. But can any of you think of how these might actually be connected, like the analogy that Mike used, like cars and a train, they're all connected together, or as we're actually proposing, that they're more than just connected, that they're all the same basic thing, just with different names. Does anyone have any ideas on how that might work out? If you want to speak, just grab a microphone. I know there's some laying on the chairs and on the stands. I don't know if anybody has any ideas on this. Let's go, Grandpa.
It's basic. It's
Hold on, there get you.
we coming alive there.
Just
Still
raise
there?
them up then.
Check, 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 mic check, mic check, 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 check. Is it good? You got it? Check, 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 check. It's not playing on the larger
We're
speaker.
not hearing it on the speaker.
Check.
Is this one working?
If you
It's
raise
on.
them all
We'll
up.
try
It's
this
on.
one?
Check, 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 check,
This
check,
one?
check, 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 check. Mic check, mic check.
This one?
There
There
it
it is.
is.
Here
There
it
it
comes.
is.
It's on.
Okay, basically, it's all trying to make everything, everybody the same. Economically the same, physically the same, even though that's totally ridiculous as far as gender is concerned. And it sounds a little whacked out.
I think that's very close. I think there's a lot of truth in that statement, that there's a desire to equalize across all dimensions, right? But what would be the underlying reason for wanting to do that? Does anybody have an idea of why you would want to equalize everything across all dimensions? What would be the underlying motivation or philosophy, psychology behind wanting to do that? Yes, Missy. Just raise them all up, Daniel. That's not going to work today.
My wild guess would be to eliminate like minority groups, like to make everyone feel like there's no minority, like no matter where you are, you're part of everybody.
That's interesting, and in a way we could say that's possible, but then we'd have to look at it and say, then why is everyone finding their way, funneling themselves into minority groups? See, that's a very interesting thing about where we're at today. We don't have where minority groups, whether we're talking about racial minorities, economic minorities, gender minority, it doesn't matter what kind, any type of minority group, you would think then that all the minority groups would be filtering themselves into majority groups.
Right.
But it's not going that way, it's going the other way.
In fact, we even find minority groups on campuses wanting to have a segregation of sorts. They want to have dorms that are their own for their minority. So it seems as though the minority groups aren't trying to eliminate the identity of the minority, but rather clarify and well establish the identity of the minority. Did you have something, Kelly?
Well, would it be I don't know exactly how it would work, but to exercise easier control, like if everyone's the same and everything's the same, then they have more control over everything. I'm not sure.
So control is an interesting idea, especially politically. But again, here's the challenge that we have. This thing of equality seems to be an odd thing, doesn't it? Because while we say there's an attempt to equality, it turns out that all the movement is in the opposite direction, not toward equality, but equality is like the leverage point being used to establish something other than equality, right? Because we have minority groups wanting to actually form a separation. For instance, it isn't so much to be called Mr. or Mrs., but now we need a whole range of gender-type pronouns in order to describe not a sameness, but a distinction. To the point where individuals can even choose their preferred gender pronoun in order that they might be distinct, not equal. In fact, wouldn't it be true that equality, in a sense, does away with a lot of distinction?
If you would think about the way even like say science fiction novels or movies would have depicted what they thought the future might look like, and it was everyone looking androgynous, right? Everyone's the same. There's like no distinctions, and there's no like Mr. and Mrs. It's all just, a number.
Yes.
But that's not where it seems at all where things are headed. It's instead of that, there's now 479 personal pronouns or whatever it is. And every day it grows more of them, not less of them, right? So I understand that it seems like that if you resist any of these modern philosophies, you're resisting very, very important, very meaningful values such as equality, which I'm not against. Right? I believe the Bible, as we pointed out last week, the New Testament and the doctrine of Jesus Christ is one of equality. Okay? But what we're looking at now, they're calling it equality, but here's the rub on this. You don't get to just call anything you want, whatever you want to call it, and by de facto it makes it that. Okay? We can call somebody thin, that doesn't make it true. We can call somebody tall, doesn't make it true. I can call this a concrete block, but it doesn't mean it's not wood. So calling things names doesn't change what they actually are. But we have today is we're talking a lot about we want equality, but what we're seeing is not equality at all. It's not even moving in the direction of equality.
That's right.
Go ahead.
So one of the points that I think that, like, when we think of how all of this ties together and what it is that actually makes this thing kind of the confusing monster that it is that this confusing monster is powered by an engine, right? There's something actually motivating all the real action that's happening, and that something that's actually motivating it is the sin that the Bible calls envy.
Let's see what Joseph had something.
Check, Mike. I'm not sure if this quite answered the question since we've kind of moved away from it, but what I find interesting in all this is that it's, as you said, there's a guy that says, like, we're aiming for equality, but in order to make equality, what they've done is focus on everybody's individual differences and try to say, well, let's see if we can plan out, and every time they think about that, they just find more and more differences, and their goal stated is to find this, everybody looks the same. But what they've done is instead note what is different about everybody else in order to try and find this goal, and all they're finding is that there's infinite differences between people. When what I think is beautiful about the gospel is the unity that truly brings equality is it levels out what is like. Everybody is under sin. Thus, everybody requires Savior, and in Christ, there's no difference of people, even though there is millions of difference among people. So then when the disciples all to come together in a community, the equality that is yielded as an effect is because everybody agrees where they are, or where they were initially, and where they're going. And so it actually yields equality because there's a unified goal rather than this effort to find all the differences and then level the playing field, which is impossible. Like even the body. Like the eyes can't do what the hands do, can't do what the feet do. But you need those differences to have a functional body. And that's what the gospel recognizes. You are different, and you are unified in this, and that yields equality.
That's
and
correct.
they don't have something that they can say they're unified in, so they're just trying to equalize the differences.
So yes, that's a very good point. So I'll get to you in just 1 second, Wesley. So you ought to get a mic while you're waiting. So I would point out to this. I would like to. It's a bit off topic on what we want to go, and that's fine. But I would like to point out to what Joseph is saying and acknowledge that of this is true. When Christianity says that we believe in equality, we put forth through the New Testament and through the epistles particularly, we put forth an explanation that accounts for God-given diversity and at the same time equality, right?
Yes.
Because the goal of Christianity is that there is no difference, like Paul says, between Jew and Gentile, male and female, between rich and poor, like James says, no distinctions, and yet we're not obliterating those distinctions. So it's a very nuanced view. And we contrast that with what world thinks of equality, if it were even true that that's what they're actually pursuing. But what we're proposing is this. They're not pursuing equality at all. This is the useful idiot of their philosophy. It is not at all the intention whatsoever. Therefore, there doesn't have to be any reconciliation between what they actually do and think to what they say. They don't even try to reconcile these. There is no reconciliation, and it's because they're not actually going in that direction. Yes, Wesley.
Check, check. Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So I'm gonna try and piggyback off of that. I think it might be in an attempt to supplant the existing norms that we have in a society right now. Like they're trying to effectively remove the identifiers that we currently have in an attempt to remove from power or remove from the social structure what they perceive to be wrong or overbearing or whatever.
So if I could, I think you're right, Wesley. I think that's a very good point to be made. And I just want you to notice that there's been a subtle shift in the definition of words and the words selected, and that subtle shift has been away from equality and toward another word, and they've selected this word very, very carefully. It was not an accident when they selected it. And when they selected it, they added a definition to it, and this is a two-step program in their mind. And the word they selected is the word equity. Now, until they selected the word equity and added to its definition, we would think of equity as your stake in an investment. How much equity do you have in an investment, and therefore, how much return do you get out of that investment? And so what they've done is step one to add a definition to that, which is equity is equality of outcome in their mind. And so while we cannot make all the races equal, and we cannot make all the genders equal, we think they ought to all have equal outcome in society. Step two will be to return to the original definition of it, and you have begun to see that happen now when they speak of things like white privilege. And in doing so, what they're saying is you have a great equity in society, a great investment that your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents made in American society, and you are today reaping the benefits of that investment. So the only way we can actually get back to a sense of equity in the first definition, or equality, is to actually disenfranchise you of the investments that your great-grandparents and your grandparents and your parents made in American society by devaluing those investments and therefore raising the value of the investments of people whose grandparents and great-grandparents didn't have the opportunity to invest in it. You understand there's a disenfranchisement that's involved in this understanding, and that is what you're speaking to, Wesley. That's exactly what's happening. Yes, Joseph.
Check. I just also wanted to note that there is something that even like scripturally we have an eye on it, that it warns that there's going to be governments that rise up. It talks about beasts, like beast, from Daniel represent this government, and so on and so forth. So we're already warned that there's going to be governments. And what I fear is that a house divided cannot stand. And what they do is they divide everybody, and then whoever is leading the corrupt engine behind it is unified in a small group, and now the evil seems to be the only thing unified. If you're able to divide everybody else, then you now have a majority that is now wielding this house that can't stand anymore. And then what eventually happens is the house is going to fall, but they're going to profit in their lifetime from their schemes behind the matter.
So we think that there is a principal concept that is behind all of this, and I think it's more base than you realize. I think that I am very adverse, so I'm going to just as a disclaimer, all right, because some of you will probably disagree with me, but I'm very adverse to almost all conspiracy theories. I think that attributing to genius what is more aptly attributed to stupidity is the right way to go, right? So I don't think there's an evil genius behind the things that happen in the world. I think there are evil idiots behind what happens in the world. That's how I look at the world. Now, I'm not, you look at it however you want, and you may think that there's this grand conspiracy a la Left Behind series books, right, and things like that. I don't think there is. I think that we can look out and see very base, very fundamental, sinful, human emotions that are at the base of all of these problems. I think sin is the best answer for what we see in the world today. The best one. If you were an atheist, you would believe evolutionary biology would be the best answer, and evolutionary psychology. You would think that would be the answer for what you see in the world. And they have explanations for that, and I can point you to some links where you can go and hear what those are, and they are fascinating. I think they're mistaken. I think that sin is a much better answer, and sin is not sophisticated. We offer sophisticated justifications for our base sin.
That's right.
What is the base of adultery? Well, if you speak to an adulterer, as I have many times in the ministry, they have a plethora of sophisticated reasons, but lust is the reason. Lust is the reason.
Right.
Right? We don't like to call it that because it's base and it's animalistic and it's earthly and it's devilish. We want to think that there's some elevated, sophisticated, brilliant reason why we do the wrong things we do. We don't want to think it's because we are acting according to our most basest of instincts. But I think that's a better answer. I think the reason, the fundamental philosophical underpinning of all of these things we're talking about, gender identity, social justice, racial justice, equity, Marxism, abortion, all of them is envy. So we're going to try to make that case in two ways today. We got to move right along now. But we're going to try to make it in two ways to you. One is we're going at the end look at some scriptures and what it has to say, and that'll lead us into the sermon, which will be more about a scriptural thing instead of a philosophical discussion. I know some people have mentioned to me that they don't really like the Sunday schools because there's not enough scripture. That's the second hour. We got a whole hour of that coming, but there are things we want to look at in other ways as well. So that's what we're doing, okay? But first we want to make the case and the argument from a logical perspective that the real problem is envy. Why don't you take it from there, Mike?
Okay. So to consider like the connection between these things, I want to make kind of the statement that these connections have really very little to do with the words that you find on the top of it, the surface of it, like victimization and all of the loaded terminology that comes with this. What's out there has very little to do with it, but the result of this upside downness, where we can use all these loaded terms, but what underlies it is envy, is that these loaded terms actually become something, so that now there's this overwhelming evidence that there's an upside in our society today to actually being a victim.
Like we said when we pointed out that you would think that people would be working their way into majorities where there's power, right? They're saying, well, there's all this power in these majorities. You would think then, if you're a victim in a minority, your goal would be to get into a majority, right? Or to compose together a coalition of minorities and be a majority. But it doesn't seem that way. They are fracturing more and more and more into smaller and smaller minorities. Why would we do this? Well, because there's an upside to it. That's the only reason. There is an incentive to do it. And what is that incentive? Well, it's an economic incentive. That's the incentive. Go ahead.
Okay, so our society has actually become rather than a meritocracy, which is kind of what you would think of as a democracy or a capitalist system, we've become exactly the opposite, where a meritocracy is actually despised and an injurocracy is what we've actually come to. Where what we're trying to do is show ourselves to be one who has suffered greater injury than another. And whoever's got the worst injury must be the one who deserves the greatest attention and therefore the greatest financial reward for it.
Think about it this way. Imagine if the victimization. Now, I want to be clear. Let me just say, just a caveat to be clear. I know that there are real victims in the world. There are many of them. We're not talking about that, okay? We're talking about the victimization, the victim mindset of people who I don't think are victims at all. How can we distinguish these two? So let's think about it this way. How do we know the difference between a real victim, and I've seen some real victims of some real injustices, especially in other countries. Like if you get down into the jungles in central Mexico, you're going to find people who really are oppressed and are dispossessed. I understand it. I've lived in it. Many of you probably have not. I've slept in their huts, on their dirt floors. I've bathed in their bucket of cold water. So I've been there. I get that. So when I look at those who proclaim themselves, who are very happy and proud to be victims, I see a marked difference. So let's look at it this way and think, why would somebody desire to be victim? Let's say that there was real victimization right now, that they really were hunting down poor people and killing them the way some people portray. Who would pretend to be poor? Doesn't seem like that would be the case, right? You'd think you would then, at all costs, not want to appear to be part of that group. And yet everybody is falling over themselves to try to be part and identify with and sympathize with these supposed victimized classes, whether it be gender, race, economic, it doesn't matter. Any of these victimized classes, the whole world, or the whole civilized world, we'll use scare quotes for civilized there, the whole civilized world is tripping over themselves to somehow be part of these victimized groups.
Right, and not, oh yeah, go ahead.
Yes, Kirsten. Well, then get it. Don't raise your hand. Get up and get a microphone.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, you get your college paid for.
Right.
Yeah.
You get your college paid for. Exactly. There are incentives, economic incentives, to be, right, gay, female, identifying as a male, but actually not a female, right, some other gender, and to be very poor and to be of some color, and it's like, bingo, you've won the lottery. It's highly incentivized to find yourself in all possible fractured minority groups.
Yes, please grab a mic.
So now I have a couple of things, because what I was going to say earlier is now just kind of trumped by what you said, because I see the irony in that, because are they not then just becoming one of the people that have been invested in? You know, and then here they're trying to become low, and then they get high. It's really backwards and strange to think how they want to be in the minority and get these incentives, but then later on, because they are college educated, presumably their generations after them will have these advantages the other ones don't. So that's crazy.
It is correct.
That's
but
right.
Also, I keep thinking, I haven't really studied on critical theory or anything much. I know someone who was going to do a sermon about it, but so really much of what I know is from listening to that person talk. But maybe the debate has moved on past this, but what I keep thinking in terms of is rights. And it's strange to me, it's interesting to consider that the more splintering of minorities there is, the more you have people that are wanting to claim their own rights. And then, you know, not everybody can have their rights. Not all rights can exist, you know, simultaneously. There's going to be someone's rights that, you know, there's always going to be a conflict in that. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak in terms of rights, because my brain just keeps thinking about the rights.
So it is true that there's always a tension between individuals and their rights, right? You say, well, I have a right to walk down this sidewalk in this direction, but here I'm coming the other way. There's only room for one of us. Somebody's going to have to yield to the other. And that's why we have laws, and that's why we have society, and that's why we have social compacts, and all of those enter in to navigate, right, and adjudicate conflicting rights. What I would say, though, in context of what we're saying is, if this was about rights, as the fight for equality has been in the past, there are times in our human history where we really were talking about equality. We're not talking about that anymore. We're just using the words, right? We're using the words of rights, but they're not rights. We're using the words of equality, but it's not equality. In fact, we're not even talking about that. That's just the word that's being bandied about in service of a very deep and very animalistic philosophy, or psychology, and that is envy. Resenting somebody who is, can do, or has something you don't. And this is a base human sin. It lies at the foundation of almost all sins. It doesn't seem that way. You wouldn't look at gender identity and think, it's envy. You wouldn't look at adultery and think, that's envy. I realize that when you first look at these, it seems like, no, that can't be the case. But it is. All of these, and I'm not saying it's the only factor, the only cause. There are many things. I realize that abortion is a very complicated issue. Absolutely. There's a lot of things involved in it, and they're all meaningful. But there is an underlying psychology that is driving it.
That's right. And you'll notice as you look out at society that every time you find one of these victim groups out there, or every time that somebody wants to identify themselves as a victim group, there seems to be somebody who's willing to stand up and be their champion, right? Some character actor who says, yes, I am the one, and in fact, in order to do that, like let's say you were looking for a really good career right now, one that would pay you a lot without having to actually know very much or do very much. The ideal thing to do would be the bagman for a victimized group, because they want you there. Other people are now going to have to include you there with them, and you're going to be able to ensure that no good outrage goes unpaid, and that your victim group gets fought for to get their rights, right, to get their piece of it, right? And we find that rise, and so we find more and more and more of these leaders of the victims groups. And something that seems rather odd to me personally is that oftentimes these leaders, the bagmen for the victim groups, aren't even a member of that group themselves, but they can represent them. In fact, it almost gives them greater entitlement to represent them, the victims group, and not be a member of that group. It is seen as even more righteous.
So what we're saying is that the underlying motivation of all this is envy. What we're also saying is that there is no real outrage on these things. I know we look at the TV, we look at the news, we listen to it, and it seems like everyone's outraged. I'm telling you that 99% of it, in my view, is fake outrage. It's outrage merchandising.
That's right.
There is a huge economic incentive to be appalled, to clutch your pearls. Huge, huge economic incentive to do so. It's a way to get your way. Christians, and I mentioned this weeks ago when I preached the sermon called We Told You So, which was about Christians having predicted this for generations. Don't listen to the liberals who think they called this 5 years ago.
Right.
Christians have been predicting this society for decades. We said, if you continue to raise your children this way, you're going to have a nation of spoiled brats who thinks they get their way through throwing temper tantrums and feigning fake injury. And that's where we're at. These people are not outraged that you didn't call them by their personal pronoun. And if there was no longer an economic incentive to be outraged over those pronouns, there would be no outrage over them. It's an amazing thing. Most of you probably have never lived in an oppressive society where the authorities have real tyrannical power. I have. There's no outrage in those societies because they get rid of those people. There's no outrage. I've been there on a road in Mexico. Policemen jump out of the back of their pickup truck with masks on. They pull somebody out of their car and beat them to death. Nobody says anything. I've seen it. Because if you want to be outraged, they're going to pull you out of your car. There's nothing stopping them.
So, if you'll think for a minute of each one of these outrages that we find right now, and you'll think of like the second word in the name of it, and just replace that with the word envy, it actually is a whole lot more accurate.
Yeah.
For instance, if you think of, say, economic injustice, and just replace that with economic envy, suddenly all of the actions and the words fit. It suddenly makes sense, because when you're asking about economic injustice, then you have to say, what do you mean by justice, and how is there an injustice, and where are the economic police, and how does that match with anybody's rights, and whose rights were actually violated in the doing of this thing, because that's what injustice would be. And the answer is, you can't find the answer to any of those questions. When you start to ask those questions, you're accused of even greater evil. But if you just change the label to economic envy, suddenly all the actions that they do make sense. And that's why it's sort of an easy one to track back to, right? To say what is actually going on here is this thing. So get rid of, what can generally be called economic incentive and victimization for any of these things. And you know what? The victimization itself also disappears. When you get rid of the economic incentive, you get rid of the reason for everybody. If you labeled it envy, suddenly everybody wouldn't like it so much. And then the economic incentive would go away. And I'm not saying that's what we should do as a group. I'm not sure it's going to help any. But I'm just saying in your mind, do this exercise and you'll see it clearly. And so if in society we suddenly did away with this economic incentive, all of a sudden the victimization disappears. And this is that kind of reflection of the despotic thing that we find out there in that everybody's accusing us of, but isn't actually there. Because if it was really, think about this for a minute. I have driven in Mexico before myself, and I have been pulled over by the police. And I have been told, you were doing something you shouldn't have been doing, which clearly wasn't the case. But if you give us this money, we will just let you go. That is despotism. That is the economic incentive for that police officer to be that way. And the point is, if you did away with that, if you suddenly made it actually illegal for them to accept a bribe, and then you actually prosecuted on it, suddenly people would stop getting pulled over for those things because the economic incentive would disappear. And there's always an economic incentive for people to stay in power. And so when we look at what this whole thing, I'd like us to consider the scriptural evidence for this.
Yeah. We're going to ask Kelly to pull up. There she goes. She's quick. She's quick on the draw. James 3:13. We're going to look at a couple verses. Before we do that, I want to reiterate that we are not saying that this would that getting rid of the merchandising of outrage would get rid of all injustice. There is injustice in the world. There is no doubt about that. I've lived in areas where it's very prevalent and very visible. I do not like it. I love the United States because of the vast amount of justice that there actually is, and how small, relatively speaking, amount of injustice there is in this country. It's an amazing thing, right? But here's a problem I want to point out too on this. As long as we allow all the fake outrage and fake victimization to happen, what we end up with, or we're going to end up with, is a lot of real victims coming out of that.
Right.
A lot of people are going to suffer that wouldn't have because of the fake victimization. We've run out of time to deal with that, so let's move on into what James has to say. So I'm going to read James 3:13, going down to 18. He says, "Who is a wise man and endued with knowledge among you? Let him show out of a good conversation his works with meekness of wisdom. But if ye have bitter envy and strife in your hearts, glory not, and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion and every evil work. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace of them that make peace." I want you to notice what James says here in this thing. He's saying there is a wisdom that is devilish and earthly and is sensual, meaning it's base, right? It's not coming from your mind, it's coming from the seat of your emotions. And what is that wisdom? He says it's envy. And where envy is, he says, there's all forms of confusion. James is essentially telling you what we are saying. The root of all these confusions is envy. Now, this isn't the only place in the Bible that makes this same exact statement.
That's right. In fact, Paul expresses the same thing in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 8. And we'll read down through verse 10. "And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." And so this is a verse that a lot of people, like, it's almost a cliche verse, right? The love of money is the root of all evil. But what he's actually saying here is this love of money, this envy, this I want what other people have, and I cannot be content in this world unless I am at the top, that kind of envy is in fact the root of all of this problem. And the confusion that's overrun the world is entirely the specialization, customization, and rehabilitation of that same old-fashioned concept of envy. We don't want to label it that. We want to call it anything else but that is exactly the root of this problem.
And what we find is, as we analyze this, that the church has been deluded with this same spirit under the guise of spiritual justice. This isn't just some little podunk church in some podunk town in Arkansas. These are names that if we mentioned them, you would recognize them. Renowned congregations, renowned pastors and teachers who are now preaching things that are the let's call it the sophistication of envy. Let me give you a couple examples. The president of the Southern Baptists, J.D. Greer, says this in September of 2019. "When it comes to questions like racial justice, gender justice, and responding to abuse charges, there has been a malaise in the church, in large part because the injustice didn't directly affect those of us sitting in places of privilege." This is coming from the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. You have someone who I admire and respect greatly, Timothy Keller of Redeemer Church in Manhattan. He writes in one of his books, "If you do not actively and generously share your resources with the poor, you are a robber, you are unjust." These claims, these views are right in line with the social outrage machine, what the social outrage machine is propagating and pushing out all across the country and around the world. This isn't just an American thing. This is basically anywhere that they have freedom, they now have the merchandising of outrage. And it's in the church. This is why we made such a big deal about this last week. There's no room in the church for Marxism. The church is not about Marxism, and it's not about capitalism either, just to be clear. To be very clear, capitalism is not the solution. One day I want to give a talk on capitalism and everything I hate about it. There's tremendous things wrong with capitalism. We won't get into that today. But I just want to be clear, this is not capitalism versus Marxism. But there is a fundamental problem with Marxism that you cannot avoid or neglect. And it is rooted in envy. Mike said that people want to have what others have, and that's what envy is. And when you can't get what others have, you go to the next best thing. And that's just kill everyone has stuff. So if we can't all have what the riches have, let's just start killing the rich. And if you think that that's hyperbole, then you need to read up on history. That's not an exceptional instance. That's the norm. You look at any Marxist society, and it immediately, within a couple years at most, devolves into the murder of millions and millions of people. And they start off with the ones that you think might deserve it. And I say you, I don't mean you personally in this room, but if you're listening to me and you think there are people out there that are horrible, filthy rich people and they need to be brought down, they need to be equalized, they start off with them. And once you've killed all the richest people, who's left? The richest people. It's like my dad. My dad says he always eats off his plate the part he likes the best. That way he's always eating what he likes the most. Even when he gets to the end and it's something he doesn't like, but it's what he likes the most of what's left. Same way. Let's kill all the rich and we'll solve the problem. So we kill them all. Who's left? The rich. Let's kill them all. And who's left? The rich. And we just keep killing until you're left. And you're the rich.
So, to wrap this up, I just want to express that we've tried to deal with this from both perspectives. We've tried to deal with it from the perspective of reason and the scriptures, both so that you could see that God is not unreasonable in his expression of this or his calling this out as being envy. So we've tried to deal with it from both, and just in case there's any confusion in your mind, we just want to leave you on this scriptural note to say, maybe you don't see. Maybe you're one of those people who looks at it and says, I don't follow all the philosophical arguments you guys have been given. You've been going through a lot of that stuff, and it doesn't always make sense to me. Fine. But then you've got the scriptural side of it too. And can you just trust the scriptures? Because what we want is to banish from your mind, if we could today do so, our desire is to banish from your entire worldview all of the elements of envy. So that you see the world from a perspective that has no element of envy in it. You're not looking at a group somewhere thinking that group is somehow the group we should do away with. Because as soon as you do that, you destroy individualism, you do all those things that we talked about last week, and you do all the things we talked about this week, which is you end up with you in the end being the group to be destroyed. But if you can just take the word of God on it by simple faith and say, here's what God said. This lust, this desire, this envy leads to confusion, strife, and in the end, death. And with that, we will leave you today. Thank you for being here and participating in Sunday school.